As the industry grew, fishing communities along the Indian River Lagoon began to revisit an age-old desire to cut an inlet through the barrier island to gain access to the fisheries of the Atlantic Ocean.
Starting with the Ice Indians, they lived on the barrier island. They were here when the Spanish came and when the 1715 fleet. And the reason I bring that up, because they were always trying to get from the river over to the ocean with their boats, and they would haul the boats over the barrier island in the narrow spots to get into the river. So when the first settlers came down the river and they fished, and they saw right across that little spit of land was an ocean with fish in it, they were forever trying to get across too.
Separated from the Atlantic Ocean by a barrier island, the Indian River Lagoon stretches from Cape Canaveral south to Jupiter Inlet. The region is so large that it spans 2 climate zones. The northern end of the lagoon is home to a variety of species that may range all the way through the Carolinas up to New Jersey. The southern end is subtropical, housing a diversity of species found in South Florida and the Caribbean. The creation of the Sebastian Inlet introduced a flow of salt water into the center of the freshwater lagoon. The brackish water allowed the Indian River to become the most species-diverse lagoon in North America.
The St. Sebastian River, which provides a tremendous amount of fresh water, makes the brackish possible. I mean, you may have areas that are more fresh or more salt, but you have these species of fish that actually adapt, and that causes a diversity in the lagoon that you don't find normally in other places. I mean, we have tarpon, which is considered saltwater, going way up the St. Sebastian River.
So we wouldn't have some species like some of these grunts, snappers and such, and groupers in the lagoon at all if we didn't have these oceanic inlets where the adults need to come in and have access to these coastal nurseries. And then once those young species grow up and they return out to the open ocean.
A number of attempts to open the inlet from 1881 to 1915 were foiled when sand washed in by the tides closed each breach almost as quickly as it was cut. But by 1918, entrepreneur and inventor Roy Couch began digging the permanent cut that would finally connect the Indian River Lagoon with the Atlantic Ocean.
My great-great-grandfather and great-grandfather both had worked on it, and they did that with mule pans and shovels and picks. The hydraulic dredges when that came around in the 1919 era.
By 1924, the inlet was open to navigation. However, despite a protective jetty, recurring sandbars forced the inlet to be closed and redug several times over the next 17 years. But in 1941, the communities around the lagoon finally allowed one last sandbar to form and close the inlet, not out of frustration, but out of fear.
In World War II, they actually allowed it to close because we had U-boats, German U-boats, offshore, and they were afraid that they would actually come through the inlet into the lagoon. But it was so important that after the war, the Corps of Engineers actually got involved in maintaining and keeping that inlet open.
After the sand was cleared and the jetties strengthened, the inlet was reopened in 1948 and has remained open ever since. Once again, the Atlantic fisheries were an easily accessible option for Sebastian's commercial fishermen.
According to what the weather was and what was available, a lot of times we fished in the ocean, or we'd fish here in the river, catch roe mullet, or earlier in the season, catch spots through the gill net. So you had something that you could do all year round if you wanted to and bring home a paycheck.
Most fishermen were paid for their catch by full-service fish houses that sprang up along the Indian River Lagoon. Here, fishermen would tie up their boats, dry and repair their nets, and gather ice and supplies for their next fishing trips. While they did so, dockside workers would unload the fish directly off the boats and carry them to the fish house. There they would be sorted, weighed, packed with ice into large barrels, and shipped off to market every day. For decades, the fish houses were the hub of the commercial fishing industry.
The waterfront was the heartbeat of this community. For obvious reasons, that's where most of the commerce took place. That's where most of the jobs were.
Sebastian didn't have many stores in it or anything. A little hardware store and a little dry goods store and a little grocery store and a post office, and had an ice plant that the power company owned and ran, and they made ice, fish ice. And the fish houses would have to go over and get big blocks of ice.
They had an ice plant downtown, and you go down and buy your ice. It was 300-pound cake of ice.
They'd have to go to the ice plant and get this ice and take it down the dock, and then you had a thing to chisel the ice to get it where you could pack the fish.
Here I was a kid with a chipper, and the most dangerous instrument, I think, created by man, to cut ice and to shave it. And you'd have to straddle that thing, and my mother would always count my toes when I came home because she knew that what I was doing behind her back. A lot of the fish back then was shipped in barrels, 200-pound barrels, and had to go to the railroad at a depot and right to the railroad track in Sebastian, and old steam engine from Miami, old 29, would come by late in the afternoon. Usually he was always 2 or 3 hours late. And they would load those fish up in those box cars, barrels of fish, and ship them to New York.
Day in and day out, trains carried fresh fish to the northern markets, and Sebastian's fishermen worked tirelessly to make sure there was a steady supply.
But a typical week for a fisherman was 7 days. And it usually, for me, I was very nocturnal, so it was from first dark to daylight. They used to call me the vampire because a lot of times I came out at midnight, after it was dark and so forth. And that's why I'd fish from then till daylight and be home before the sun came up.
It's one of those jobs, you gotta love it or you need to get out of it. And it's not a job, it's a life. And it really affects your family. You have to have a special spouse to be a fisherman's wife because it's a lot of time.
Generally, you're putting in 12, 15 hours a day hook and line fishing in the summer months. So it's generally long hours. There's very few short days in commercial fishing. And if you're not fishing, you're always working on a boat, or taking care of some gear of some type. It's never ending.
But every now and then, the fishing community would come together and relax. At these times, the fish houses would take on a new role.
The fish houses in the Sebastian area was really, it was a social place for barbecues and impromptu oyster roast. Sometimes there'd be a little drinking going on, sometimes a little singing going on. Every now and then there may be a little scuffle going on, but it was the focal point. It was the center of town. It's where everything happened. It was where the activity happened.
We'd have big island parties, the assemblers would, probably a couple times a month, and everyone would bring covered dish and come out to the local spoil islands, and it was a real nice time to be a kid growing up, barefooted around the fish house.
$10 for a pay one queen.
I think anywhere that you go in the state of Florida where you have a commercial fishing village, a commercial fishing heritage, and a culture of people who have been there for generations of time, they're like a family. They may not get along all the time. Of course, family members don't. But you'll find that there's a sense of community in any one of these little villages that you go to, a very tight-knit sense of community. And I'm glad that it's that way, because we try to protect what we have. We try to keep our identity. And unfortunately, in Florida today, in these coastal communities, that's rapidly disappearing.